was a lumbering barge that heaved as long sweeps propelled it across the harbor's choppy surface. The ropes lashing a merchant's half-dozen canvas-covered wagons to the cleats on the deck creaked with every shift. The horses stamped their hooves nervously, and the oarsmen had to fend off wagon drivers and hired guards who wanted to empty their bellies over the side. Some men had no stomach for the motion of water. The merchant herself, a plump-faced woman with a coppery skin, stood in the bow, wrapped in her dark cloak,
Okay, boy.
balancing easily with the ferry's movements, staring fixedly at the approaching landing and ignoring Kareed beside her. She might know that he was Sean Chan, from the saddle on his bay gelding, if nothing else, but a plain gray cloak covered his red-trimmed green coat. So if she thought of him at all, it was as an ordinary soldier, not a settler with a sword on his hip. There might have been sharper eyes back in the city, despite all he had done to evade them, but there was nothing he could do about that. With luck, he had a day, perhaps two, before anyone realized he would not be returning to the inn anytime soon. Swinging into his saddle as soon as the ferry bumped hard against the landing dock's leather-padded posts, he was first off when the loading gate swung wide. The merchant was still chivying her drivers to the wagons and the ferryman unlashing wheels. He kept Aldazar to a slow walk across the stones, still slippery with the morning's rain, a litter of horse dung, and the leavings of a flock of sheep, and let the base pace increase only when he reached the Ilion road itself, though he kept short of a trot even then. Impatience was a vice when beginning a journey of unknown length. Inns lined the road beyond the landing, flat-roofed buildings covered in cracked and flaking white plaster and with faded signs out front, or none at all. This road marked the northern edge of the Rahad, and roughly dressed men slouching on benches in front of the inns sullenly watched him pass. Not because he was Shanshan. He suspected they would have been no brighter for anyone on horseback. Anyone who had 2 coins to rub, for that matter. Soon he left them behind, though, and the next few hours took him past olive orchards and small farms where the workers were accustomed enough to passers-by on the road that they did not look up from their labors. The traffic was sparse in any case, a handful of high-wheeled farmers' carts and twice a merchant's train rumbling toward Abu Dar, surrounded by hired guards. Many of the drivers and both merchants wore distinctive Ilioner beards. It seemed strange that Ilion continued to send its trade to Abu Dar while fighting to resist the empire. But people on this side of the Eastern Sea were often peculiar, with odd customs, and little like the stories told of the great Hawkwing's homeland. Often nothing like. They must be understood, of course, if they were to be brought into the empire, but understanding was for others higher than he. He had his duty. The farms gave way to woodlands and fields of scrub, and his shadow was lengthening in front of him, the sun more than halfway to the horizon by the time he saw what he was looking for. Just ahead, Ajimbura was squatting on the north side of the road, playing a reed flute, the image of an idler shirking. Before Kareed reached him, he tucked the flute behind his belt, gathered his brown cloak, and vanished into the brush and trees. Glancing behind to make sure the road was empty in that direction as well, Kareed turned Aldazar into the woodland at the same point. The little man was waiting just out of sight of the road, among a stand of some sort of large pine tree, the tallest easily 100 feet. He made his hunch-shouldered bow and scrambled into the saddle of a lean chestnut with 4 white feet. He insisted that white feet on the horse were lucky. "This way, High One," he said, and at Kareed's gesture of permission, turned his mount deeper into the forest. They had only a short way to ride, no more than half a mile, but no one passing on the road could have suspected what waited there in a large clearing. Mesenji had brought 100 of the guard on good horses and 20 Ogier gardeners, all in full armor, along with pack animals to carry supplies for 2 weeks. The pack horse Ajimbura had brought out yesterday with Kareed's armor would be among them. A cluster of Suldam were standing beside their own mounts, some petting the 6-leashed Damani. When Mesenji rode forward to meet Kareed with Hartha, the first gardener, striding grim-faced beside him with his green-tasseled axe over his shoulder, one of the women, Melatine, the High Lady Tuan's Der Suldam, stepped into her saddle and joined them. Mesenji and Hartha touched fists together, and Kareed returned their salute, but his eyes went to the Damani, to one in particular, a small woman whose hair was being stroked by a dark, square-faced Suldam. A Damani's face was always deceptive. They aged slowly and lived a very long time. But this one had a difference he had learned to recognize as belonging to those who called themselves Aes Sedai. What excuse did you use to get all of them out of the city at once? He asked. Exercise, Benner General, Malatine replied with a wry smile. Everyone always believes exercise. It was said the High Lady Tuan in truth needed no Dare Saddam to train her property or her Sultan. But Malatine, with less black than gray in her long hair, was experienced in more than her craft, and she knew what he was really asking. He had requested that Musenji bring a pair of Tamani if he could. None of us would be left behind, Benner General. Never for this. As for Mylan, that must be the former Aes Sedai. After we left the city, we told the Damani why we were going. It's always best if they know what's expected. We've been calling Mylan ever since. She loves the High Lady. They all do. But Mylan worships her as though she already sat on the crystal throne. If Mylan gets her hands on one of those Aes Sedai, she chuckled. We'll have to be quick to keep the woman from being too big to be worth leashing.
I sense no cause for laughter,
Arthur rumbled. The Ogier was even more weathered and grizzled than Musenji, with long gray mustaches and eyes like black stones staring out of his helmet. He had been a gardener since before Kharid's father was born, maybe before his grandfather.
We have no target. We are trying to catch the wind in a net.
Malatine sobered quickly, and Musenji began to look grimmer than Hartha if that was possible. In 10 days, the people they sought would have put many miles between them. The best the White Tower could send would not be so blatant as to head due east after trying the ruse of Jahanna, nor so stupid as to head too close to north. Yet that left a vast and ever-expanding area to be searched. Then we must begin spreading our nets without delay, Kharid said, and spread them finely. Musenji and Hartha nodded. With the Death Watch guard, what must be done would be done, even to catching the wind. Chapter 5. The Forging of a Hammer. He ran easily through the night in spite of the snow that covered the ground. He was one with the shadows slipping through the forest, the moonlight almost as clear to his eyes as the light of the sun. A cold wind ruffled his thick fur, and suddenly brought a scent that made his hackles stand and his heart race with a hatred greater than that for the Neverborn. Hatred and a sure knowledge of death. There were no choices. Not now. He ran harder toward death. Perrin woke abruptly and beneath one of the high-wheeled supply cars. Cold had seeped into his bones from the ground, despite his heavy fur-lined cloak and 2 blankets. And there was a fitful breeze, not strong or steady enough to be called a light wind, but icy. When he scrubbed at his face with his gauntleted hands, frost. At least it seemed not to have snowed anymore during the night. Too often he had awakened covered with a dusting despite the shelter of a cart. Snowfall made things difficult for the scouts. He wished he could speak with Elias the same way he talked with wolves. Then he would not have to endure this endless waiting. Weariness clung to him like a second skin. He could not recall when he at last had a sound night's sleep. Sleep, or the lack of it, seemed unimportant anyway. These days, only the heat of anger gave him the strength to keep moving. He did not think it was the dream that had wakened him. Every night he lay down expecting nightmares, and every night they came. In the worst, he found Fail dead, or never found her. Those woke him up in shivering sweats. Anything less horrible, he slept through, or only half woke, with Trollocs cutting him up alive with a cookpot, or a Drakkar eating his soul. This dream was fading quickly, in the manner of dreams, yet he remembered being a wolf and smelling... what? Something wolves hated more than they did Murderall. Something a wolf knew would kill him. The knowledge he had in the dream, only vague impressions remained. He was not in the wolf dream, that reflection of this world where dead wolves lived on, and the living could go to consult them. The wolf dream always remained clear in his head after he left, whether he had gone there consciously or not. Yet this dream still seemed real, and somehow urgent. Lying motionless on his back, he sent his mind questing, feeling for wolves. He had tried using wolves to help his hunt, to no avail. Convincing them to take an interest in the doings of 2 Legs was difficult, to say the least. They avoided large parties of men, and for them half a dozen was large enough to stay clear of. Men chased away game, and most men tried to kill a wolf on sight. His thoughts found nothing, but then, after a time, he touched wolves at a distance. How far, he could not be sure, but it was like catching a whisper. Here. That was strange. Despite scattered villages and manors, and even the occasional town, this was prime country for wolves. Untouched forest for the most part, with plenty of deer and smaller game. There was always a formality to speaking with the pack you were not part of. Politely, he sent his name among wolves, Young Bull, shared his scent, and received theirs in reply. Leaf Hunter, and Tall Bear, Whitetail and Feather, and Thunder Mist, a cascade of others. It was a sizable pack, and Leaf Hunter, a female with a feel of quiet certainty, was their leader. Feather, clever, and was her mate. They had heard of Young Bull, were eager to speak with the friend of the fabled Long Tooth. The first two legs would learn to speak with wolves after a gap of time that carried the feel of ages vanished into the mists of the past. It was all a torrent of images and memories of sense that his mind turned into words, as the words he thought somehow became images and sense that they could understand. There is something I want to learn, he thought, once the greetings were done. What would a wolf hate more than the Neverborn? He tried to recall the scent from the dream, to add that, but it was gone from his memory. Something that a wolf knows means death. Silence answered him, and a thread of fear blended hatred and determination and reluctance. He had felt fear from wolves before. Above all things, they feared the wildfire that raced through a forest, or so he would have said. But this was the prickling sort of fear that made a man's skin crawl, made him shiver and jump at things unseen. Laced with the resolution to go on no matter what, it felt close to terror. Wolves never experienced that kind of dread, except that these did. One by one they faded from his consciousness, a deliberate act of shutting him out, until only Leaf Hunter remained. The last hunt is coming, she said at last. And then she also Did I offend? He said. If I did, it was in ignorance. But there was no reply. These wolves, at least, would not speak with him again. Not any time soon. The last hunt is coming. That was what wolves called the last battle, Tarmangaiden. They knew they would be there, at the final confrontation between the light and the shadow, though why was something they could not explain. Some things were fated, as sure as the rise and fall of the sun and the moon, and it was fated that many wolves would die in the last hunt. What they feared was something else. Perrin had a strong sense that he also had to be there, was meant to be at least. But if the last battle came soon, he would not be. He had a job of work in front of him that he could not shirk, would not, even for Tarmangaiden. Putting nameless fears and the last battle alike out of his mind, he fumbled his gauntlets off and felt in his coat pocket for the length of rawhide cord he kept there. In a morning ritual, his fingers made another knot mechanically and slid down the cord, counting. 22 knots. 22 mornings since Fail was kidnapped. At the start, he had not thought there was need to keep count. That first day, he had believed he was cold and numb, but focused. Yet looking back, he could see he had been overwhelmed by unbound rage and a consuming need to find the Shido as fast as possible. Men from other clans had been among the Aiel who had stolen Fail, yet on the evidence, most were Shido, and that was how he felt. The need to get Fail away from them before she could be hurt had gripped him by the throat till he almost choked. He would rescue the other women captured with her, of course, but sometimes he had to list their names in his head to make sure he did not forget them entirely. Aleandra Maritha Kagarin, Queen of Gildan, and his liege woman. It still seemed off-kilter to have anyone oath-sworn to him, especially a queen. He was a blacksmith. He had been a blacksmith once. But he had responsibilities toward Aleandra, and she would never have been in danger except for him. Bane, of the Black Rock Sharad, and Chiad, of the Stones River Goshin, Aiel maidens of the Spear who followed Fail to Gildan and Amadisia. They had faced Trollocs in the Two Rivers as well, when every hand that could raise a weapon, and that earned them the right to call on him. Arla Shigo and Lasil Alderwin, two foolish young women who thought they could learn to be Aiel, or some strange version of Aiel. They were oath-sworn to Aiel, and so was Meg Dindorlin, a penniless refugee Aiel had taken under her wing as one of her maids. He could not abandon Aiel's people. Aiel ni Bashir Tabara. The litany came back to her, his wife, the breath of his life. With a groan, he clutched the cord so tightly that the knots impressed themselves painfully on a hand hardened by long days swinging the hammer at a forge. Light. 22 days. Working iron taught him that haste ruined metal, but in the beginning he had been hasty, traveling southward through gateways created by Grady and Niald, the Tuashaman, to where the farthest traces of the Shido had been found, then leaping south again, the direction their tracks went, as soon as the Ashaman could make more gateways. Fretting every hour it took them to rest from making the first and holding them open long enough for everyone to pass through, his mind was eaten up with freeing Aiel at any cost. What he found were days of increasing pain as the scouts spread farther and farther through uninhabited wilderness without locating the slightest sign that anyone had been that way before, until he knew he had to retrace his path, frittering away more days to cover ground the Ashaman had taken him across in a step, searching for any indication of where the Shido had turned aside. He should have known they would turn. South took them toward warmer lands, without the snow that seemed so strange to Aiel, yet it took them closer to the Shonchan and Ibudar as well. He knew about the Shonchan, and he should have expected the Shido to learn. They were a village, not a fight with Shonchan and Damani. Days of slow marching with the scouts fanning out ahead, days when falling snow blinded even the Aiel and forced them all to a chafing halt, until finally Jundin Baron found a tree scraped by a wagon, and Elias dug a broken Aiel spear shaft from beneath the snow. And Perrin at last turned east, at most 2 days south of where he had traveled to the first time. He had wanted to howl when he realized that, yet he kept a tight hold on himself. He could not give way, not so much as an inch, not when Aiel was depending on him. That was when he began to husband his anger, began to forge it. His kidnappers had gained a long lead because he was hasty, but since then he had been as careful as he had been in a smithy. His anger was hardened and shaped to a purpose. Since finding the Shido's trail again, he had traveled no farther in one jump than the scouts could come and go between sunrise and sunset. And it was well that he had been cautious, because the Shido changed directions suddenly several times, zigzagging almost as though they could not decide on a destination. Or maybe they had turned to join others of their kind. All he had to go by were old traces, old camps buried by snow. Yet all of the scouts agreed the Shido's numbers had swollen. There had to be at least 2 or 3 sets together, maybe more. A formidable quarry to hunt. Slowly but surely, though, he had begun overtaking them. That was what was important. The Shido covered more ground on the march than he would have thought possible, given their numbers in the snow, yet they did not seem to care whether anyone was tracking them. Perhaps they believed no one dared. Sometimes they had camped several days in one spot. Anger forged to a purpose. Ruined villages and small towns littered the Shido's path as if they were human locusts. Storehouses and valuables looted, men and women carried off along with the livestock. Often no one remained by the time he arrived, only empty houses, the people seeking somewhere for food to survive until spring. He had crossed the Eldar into Altara, where a small ferry used by peddlers and local farmers, not merchants, once ran between 2 villages on the forested riverbanks. How the Shido had gotten across, he did not know. But he had the Ashaman make gateways. All that remained of the ferry were the rough stone landings on either bank, and the few unburned structures were deserted except for 3 slat-ribbed feral dogs that slunk away at the sight of humans. Anger hardened and shaped for a hammer. Yesterday morning, he had come to a tiny village where a double handful of stunned, dirty-faced people had stared at the hundreds of lancers and bowmen riding out of the forest at first light, behind the Red Eagle of Manethran and the Crimson Wolf's Head, the Silver Stars of Gildan and the Golden Hawk of Mayen, followed by long lines of high-wheeled carts and strings of remounts. At first sight of Gaul and the other Aiel, those people overcame their paralysis and began running for the trees in panic. Catching a few to answer questions had been difficult. They were ready to run themselves to death rather than let an Aiel near. Brighton had consisted of only a dozen families, but the Shido had carried off 9 young men and women from there, along with all of their animals, only 2 days ago. 2 days. A hammer was a tool with a purpose and a target. He knew he had to be careful, or lose Fail forever, but being too careful could lose her too. Early yesterday, he had told those who were going ahead to scout that they were to go farther than before, push on harder, returning only with a full turn of the sun, unless they found the Shido sooner. In a little while the sun would rise, and at most a few hours after that, Elias and Gall and the others would return. The maidens and Two Rivers men, he knew, could track a shadow across water. As fast as the Shido moved, the scouts could move faster. They were not encumbered with families and wagons and captives. This time they would be able to tell him exactly where the Shido were. They would. He knew it in his bones. The certainty flowed in his veins. He would find Fail and free her. That came before anything, even living, so long as he lived long enough to accomplish it. Yet he was a hammer now, and if there was any way to accomplish it, any way at all, he intended to hammer these Shido into scrap. Tossing the blankets aside, Perrin tugged his gauntlets back on, gathered his axe from where it lay beside him, a half-moon blade balanced by a heavy spike, and rolled out into the open, rising to his feet in the trampled, frozen snow. Carts stood all around him in rows, in what had been Brighton's fields. The arrival of more strangers, so many, and armed with their foreign banners, had been more than the survivors of the little village could absorb. As soon as Perrin would let them, the pitiful remnant had fled into the forest, carrying what they could on their backs and on drag sleds. They had run as hard as if Perrin was another Shido, not looking back for fear he was following them. As he slipped the axe haft through the thick loop on his belt, a deeper shadow beside a nearby cart grew taller and resolved into a man swathed in a cloak that seemed black in the darkness. Perrin was not surprised. The nearby horse lines thickened the air with the smell of several thousand animals, mounts and remounts, and cart horses, not to mention the sweet stink of horse dung, but he still had caught the other's scent on waking. Man's smell always stood out. Besides, Aram was always there when Perrin woke, waiting. A waning sickle moon, low in the sky, still gave enough light for him to make out the other man's face, if not clearly, and the brass-pommeled hilt of his sword slanting up against his shoulder. Aram had been a tinker once, but Perrin did not think he would be again, even if he did wear a brightly striped tinker coat. There was a frowning hardness about Aram now that moon shadows could not hide. He stood as though ready to draw that sword, and since Fail was taken, anger seemed a permanent part of his scent. A great deal had changed when Fail was taken. Anyway, Perrin understood anger. He had not really, before Fail was taken. "They want to see you, Lord Perrin," Aram said, jerking his head toward two dim forms farther away between the lines of carts. The words came out in a faint mist in the cold air. "I told them to let you sleep." It was a fault Aram had, looking after him too much, unasked. Testing the air, Perrin separated out the scent of the two shadows from the masking smell of the horses. "I'll see them now. Have Steppa ready for me, Aram." He tried to be in the saddle before the rest of the camp woke. Partly that was because standing still for long seemed beyond him. Standing still was not catching the Shido. Partly it was to avoid having to share anyone's company he could avoid. He would have gone out with the scouts himself if the men and women already doing that job were not so much better at it than he. "Yes, my lord." A jaggedness entered Aram's scent as he trudged away across the snow, but Perrin barely noticed it. Only something important would make Sebin Bulwer root himself out of his blankets in the dark, and as for Salanda Derengil, Bulwer appeared skinny, even in a bulky coat, his pinched face all but hidden in the deep hood. Had he stood straight instead of hunching, he still would have been taller than the Kyrianan woman, who was not tall. With his arms wrapped around himself, he was hopping from one foot to the other, trying to avoid the cold that must be soaking through his boots. Salanda, in a man's dark coat and breeches, made a good effort at ignoring the temperature despite the feathery white that marked every breath. She was shivering, but managed to swagger standing still, with one side of her cloak thrown back, and a gloved hand on the hilt of her sword. The hood of her cloak was lowered too, exposing hair cut short except for the tail in the back that was tied at the nape of her neck with a dark ribbon. Salanda was the leader of those fools who wanted to be imitation Aiel who carried swords. Her scent was soft and thick, like a jelly. She was worried. Bulwer smelled intent. But then he nearly always did, though there was never any heat to his intensity, only focus. The skinny little man stopped hopping to make a stiff hurry. The Lady Salanda has news I think you should hear from her lips, my lord. Bulwer's thin voice was dry and precise, just like its owner. He would sound the same with his neck on a headsman's block. Milady, if you would. He was only a secretary, Fail's secretary, and Perrin's, a fussy, self-effacing fellow for the most part, and Salanda was a noblewoman, but Bulwer made that more than a request. She gave him a sharp sideways glance, shifting her sword, and Perrin tensed to grab her. He did not think she would actually draw on the man, but then again, he was not sure enough of her, or any of her ridiculous friends, to put it out of the question. Bulwer merely watched her, his head tilted to one side, and his smell carried impatience, not concern. With a toss of her head, Salanda turned her attention to Perrin. I see you, Lord Perrin Goldeneyes, she began in the crisp accents of Carian, but aware that he had little patience for her pretend Aiel formality, she hurried on. I have learned 3 things tonight. First, the least important. Javier, that Massima sent another rider back toward Amadicia yesterday. Nerion tried to follow, but lost him. Tell Nerion I said he isn't to follow anybody, Perrin told her sharply. And tell Javier the same. They should know that. They are to watch, listen, and report what they see and hear, no more. Do you understand me? Salanda gave a quick nod, a thorn of fear entering the scent for a moment. Fear of him, Perrin supposed, fear that he was angry with her. Yellow eyes in a man made some people uneasy. He took his hand from his axe and clasped both hands behind his back. Javier and Nerion were more of Fail's 24 young fools, one Tylan, the other Carianan. Fail had used the lot of them for eyes and ears, a fact that still irritated him for some reason, though she had told him to his face that spying was a wife's business. A man needed to listen hard when he thought his wife was joking. She might not be. The whole notion of spying made him uncomfortable, but if Fail could use them so, then so could her husband, when there was need. Just the 2, though. Massima seemed convinced that everyone except dark friends were facing him sooner or later. Yet he might grow suspicious if too many left Perrin's camp to join him. Don't call him Massima, not even here, he added brusquely. Lately the man claimed Massima Dagar was actually dead and risen from the grave as the prophet of the Lord Dragon reborn. And he was touchier than ever about mention of his former name. You get careless with your tongue in the wrong place, and you might be lucky if he just has a few of his bully boys flog you the next time they can find you alone. Salanda nodded again, gravely, and this time without any fear smell. Light, those idiots of Fail's lack the sense to recognize what they should be afraid of. It's almost dawn, Bulwer murmured, shivering and pulling his cloak tighter. All will be waking before long, and some matters are best discussed unseen. If my lady will continue? Once again, that was more than a suggestion. Salanda and the rest of Fail's hangers-on had been good only for causing trouble, that Perrin could see, and Bulwer looked to be trying to put a fly up her nose for some reason, but she actually gave an embarrassed start and murmured an apology. The darkness truly was beginning to lessen, Perrin realized, at least to his eyes. The sky overhead still looked black, dusted with bright stars, yet he could almost make out the colors of the 6 thin stripes that crossed the front of Salanda's coat. He could tell one from another, anyway. The realization that he had slept later than usual made him growl. He could not afford to give in to weariness, however tired he was. He needed to hear Salanda's report. She would not be worried about Massima sending out riders. The man did that almost every day. Yet he looked anxiously for Aram and Stepper. His ears picked up the sounds of activity among the horse lines, but there was no sign of his horse yet. The second thing, my lord, Salanda said. I have seen casks of salt fish and salt beef, branded with Altaran markings. A great many of them. He says there are Altarans among the prophet's people too. Several appear to be craftsfolk, and 1 or 2 could be merchants or town officials. Established men and women in any case, solid folk. And some seem unsure they made the right decision. A few questions might reveal from where the fish and beef came, and perhaps gain more eyes and ears for you. I know where the fish and beef came from, and so do you, Perrin said irritably. His hands knotted into fists behind his back. He had hoped the speed with which he was moving would keep Massima from sending out raiding parties. That was what they were, and as bad as the Shido, if not worse. They offered people a chance to swear to the Dragon Reborn, and those who refused, sometimes those who simply hesitated too long, died by fire and steel. In any case, whether or not they marched off to fight, those who swore were expected to donate generously in support of the Prophet's cause, while those who died were plainly dark friends, their belongings forfeit. Thieves lost a hand by Massima's laws, but none of what his raiders did was thieving, according to Massima. By his laws, murder and a whole host of other crimes merited hanging, yet a fair number of his followers seemed to prefer killing to receiving oaths. There was more loot that way, and for some of them, murder was a fine game to play before eating. Tell them to keep clear of these Altarans, Baron went on. All sorts drift into Massima's following, and even if they are having second thoughts, it won't take them long to stink of zeal like the rest. They wouldn't hesitate to gut a neighbor then, much less somebody who's asked the wrong questions. What I want to know is what Massima's doing, what he's planning. But the man had some scheme seemed obvious. Massima claimed it was blasphemy for anyone except Rand to touch the One Power, claimed he wanted nothing more than to join Rand in the East. As always, thought of Rand brought colors whirling through Perrin's head, more vividly than usual this time, but anger melted them to vapor. Blasphemy or no, Massima had accepted traveling, which was not just channeling, but men channeling. And no matter what he claimed, he had done it to remain in the West as long as possible, not to help rescue Fail. Perrin tended to trust people until they proved unreliable, but one sniff of Massima had told him the fellow was as insane as a rabid animal, and less trustworthy. He had considered ways to stop that scheme, whatever it was, ways to stop Massima's killing and burning. Massima had 10 or 12,000 men with him, maybe more. The man was not very forthcoming about numbers, and the way they camped in a squalid sprawl made counting impossible. While less than a quarter of that number followed Perrin, several hundred of them cart drivers and grooms and others who would be more hindrance than help in a fight. Yet with 3 Aes Sedai and 2 Ashaman, not to mention 6 Aiel Wise Ones, he could halt Massima in his tracks. The Wise Ones and 2 of the Aes Sedai would be eager to take part. More than simply willing, at least. They wanted Massima dead. But dispersing Massima's army would only break it into hundreds of smaller bands that would scatter across Altara and beyond, still looting and killing, just for themselves instead of in the name of the Dragon Reborn. Breaking the Shido will do the same thing, he thought, and pushed the thought away. Stopping Massima would take time he did not have. The man would have to keep until Fail was safe, until the Shido was smashed to kindling. What's the third thing you learned tonight, Salanda? He said roughly. To his surprise, the smell of worry coming from the woman thickened. Javier saw someone, she said slowly. He did not tell me at first. Her voice hardened for a moment. I made sure that will not happen again. Drawing a deep breath, she seemed to struggle with herself, then burst out. Masuri Sedai has visited Massima, the prophet. It is true, my lord, believe me. Javier has seen her more than once. She slips into their camp hooded and leaves the same way. But he has had a good look at her face twice. A man accompanies her each time, and sometimes another woman. Javier has not seen the man well enough to be sure, but the description fits Rover, Masuri's warder, and Javier is certain the second woman is Anura Sedai. She broke off abruptly, her eyes shining darkly in the moonlight as she watched him. Like she was as worried about how he would take it as about what it meant. He forced his hands to unclench. Massima despised Aes Sedai as much as he did dark friends. He nearly considered them dark friends. So why would he receive 2 sisters? Why would they go to him? Anura's opinion of Massima lay hidden behind Aes Sedai mystery and double-jointed comments that could mean anything. But Masuri had said straight out that the man needed to be put down like a mad dog. Make sure Javier and Nerion keep a sharp eye for the sisters, and see if they can eavesdrop on one of their meetings with Massima. Could Javier be mistaken? No. There were a few women in Massima's camp, relatively speaking, and it passed belief that the tyrant could mistake one of those unwashed, murdericide harridans from Missouri. The sort of women willing to march with Massima usually made the men look like tinkers. Tell them to take care, though. Better to let the chance pass than get caught at it. They're no good to anyone strung up on a tree. Perrin knew he sounded gruff and tried to make his voice milder. That seemed harder since Fail was kidnapped. You've done well, Salanda. At least he did not sound as if he were barking at her. You and Javier and Nerion. Bail would be proud if she knew. A smile lit up her face, and she stood a little straighter, if that was possible. Pride, lean and bright, the pride of accomplishment, almost overwhelmed any other scent from her. Thank you, my lord. Thank you. He would have thought he had given her a prize. Maybe he had, come to think on it. Though, come to think, Bail might not be best pleased that he was using her eyes and ears, or even knew about them. Once the thought of Fail displeased would have made him uneasy, but that was before he learned about her spies, and that little matter of the broken crown that Elias had let slip. Everybody always said that wives kept their secrets close, but there were limits. Adjusting his cloak on his narrow shoulders with one hand, Bulwer coughed behind the other. Well said, my lord. Very well said. Lady, I'm sure you want to pass on Lord Perrin's instructions as soon as possible. It wouldn't do for there to be any misunderstanding. Solanda nodded without taking her eyes off Perrin. Her mouth opened, and Perrin was sure she intended to say something about hoping he found water and shade. Light. Water was the one thing they had in plenty, even if it was mostly frozen. And this time of year, nobody needed shade even at noon. She probably did intend it because she hesitated before saying, Grace favor you, my lord. If I may be so bold, Grace has favored the Lady Fail and you. Perrin jerked his head in a nod of thanks. There was a taste of ashes in his mouth. Grace had a funny way of leaving her, giving her a husband who still had not found her. The maidens said she had been that she would not be mistaken, but they had to admit that they already had broken their customs 100 different ways. In his book, being kidnapped was mistreatment enough. But people do very well, my lord, said softly, watching someone stand in the darkness among the carts. This approval was a surprise. He had tried to talk Perrin out of using Solanda and her friends on the grounds they were hot-headed and unreliable. She has the necessary instincts. Arian and do, usually, and tyrants to some extent. At least the nobles, especially ones. He cut off abruptly, eyed Perrin cautiously. Perrin would have believed he was but he wanted to in that fashion. The scent remained steady, not jiggling the way it would in a man who was unsure. May I offer one or 2 points in her report, my lord? The crunch of hooves in the snow announced the approach of Aram, leading Perrin's dun stallion, and her rangy gray gelding. The 2 animals were trying to nip at one another, but Aram was keeping them apart, though with some difficulty. Walter sighed. You can say whatever you need to say about Aram, Master Bulwer, Perrin said. The little man bowed his head in acquiescence, but he sighed again, too. Everybody in the camp knew that Bulwer had the skill of fitting together rumors and chance-heard comments and things people had done to form a picture of what had really happened or what might. Bulwer himself had his job as a secretary. For some reason he liked to pretend he never did any such thing. It was a harmless pretense, and Perrin tended to humor him. Taking Stepper's reins from Aram, he said, Walk behind us a while, Aram. I need to talk with Master Bulwer in private. Bulwer's sigh was so faint that Perrin barely heard it. Aram fell in behind the 2 of them and began to walk, frozen beneath their feet. But his scent returned again, and quivery, a sour smell. This time Perrin recognized the scent, though he paid it no more mind than usual. Aram was jealous of anyone except Fail who spent time with him. Perrin didn't stop to it, anyway. He was used to Aram's possessiveness, as he was to the Bulwer hopped along at his side, tapping on his shoulder to see whether Aram was close enough to hear.
That was a good one there.
Speak. Bulwer's razor-thin scent of suspicion, curiously dry, not even warm, but still suspicion, provided a counterpoint to Aram's jealousy. You could not change men who did not want to change. The horse lines and supply carts were located in the middle of the camp, where thieves would have a hard time reaching them. And although the sky still looked black to most eyes, the cart drivers and grooms who slept close to their charges were already awake and folding their blankets, some tending shelters made of pine boughs, and other small tree limbs harvested from the surrounding forest, in case they might be needed. Cook fires were being lit, black kettles set over them, though there was little to eat except porridge or dried beans. Hunting and trapping added some meat, venison and rabbits, partridges and wood hens and the like, but that could only go so far with so many to feed, and there had been nowhere to buy supplies since before crossing the Eldar.
Hey, Scratchy with
A
D,
ripple of
man.
bows and
How you
curses,
doing, bro?
murmurs of a good morning, my lord, and the light favor you, my lord, followed Baron, but the men and women who saw him
I'm
stopped
not doing
to try and
too
strap
bad.
into shelters, and a
I
few
can't
began to pull Bill
complain.
down, as though they had sensed his determination from his stride. They should have known his resolve.
How's your night going?
Since the day he realized how badly he had blundered, he
I
had not
did,
spent 2 nights in one place.
a little live
horses and carts.
earlier today working on mine.
With the Two Rivers men divided into 4 groups. The Lancers from Gildan.
I might do another one tomorrow.
Between them. Whoever came at them, from whatever direction, will face Two Rivers.
Hell yeah.
It was not
I need to quit slacking on mine.
The men seemed to be following him meekly enough, but aside from this news of raiding, 9 Gildanan and 8 Mayenners had vanished in the last 2 weeks, and no one believed they had deserted. Before that, on the day Fail was stolen, 20 Mayenners had been ambushed and killed, and no one believed it had been anyone
It's starting to go
who did the killing.
a little faster.
An uneasy peace existed, a strange, thorny sort of peace. Got a copper weight on it, exactly a copper law. Massima pretended to be unaware of any danger to that peace, but his followers seemed not to care one way or the other. And whatever Massima pretended, they took their lead from him. Somehow, though, Baron intended to see that it endured until Fail was free. Making his own camp too tough a nut to crack was one way of making the peace last.
Yeah, I got a couple just like that.
The Aiel had insisted on having their own thin wedge of the strange pie.
I've had a couple there like that, that just 2 bags, 3 bags of black.
He paused to study their low, dark tents. The only other tents erected anywhere in the camp were those of Berlain and her 2 serving women, on the other side of the camp, not far from Brighton's few houses. Fleas and lice in hordes made those uninhabitable, even for hardened soldiers seeking shelter from the cold, and the barns were putrid.
Because after I finished that little mushroom grove that I'm working on, I'm going to start on this one.
The only man among the Aiel not Kaishan were all out with the scouts, and the Aiel tents were silent and still, though the smell of smoke coming from some of the vent holes told them the Gaishan were preparing breakfast for the wise ones, or serving it. Anura was Berlain's advisor, and usually shared her tent, but Masuri and Sionid would be with the wise ones, maybe even helping the Gaishan with breakfast. They still tried to hide the fact that the wise ones considered them apprentices, though everyone in camp must be aware of it by now. Anyone who saw an Aes Sedai actually carrying firewood, or water, or heard one being swift, could make it out. The 2 Aes Sedai were oaths sworn to rest. Again, they melted under his constant anger. But Idara and the other wise ones had been sent to keep an eye on them. Only the Aes Sedai themselves knew how tightly their oaths held them, or what room they saw to maneuver between the words, and neither was allowed to hop unless a wise one said toad. Sionid and Masuri had both said Massima should be put down like a mad dog, and the wise ones agreed. Or so they said.
Yeah, but that's the one that I'm going to be doing after I get this one done. Or like that mushroom grove I'm working on.
One of the wise ones telling him that
because it pretty much looks like, watch, I'll show you.
Unless the wise one said toad. It was like a blacksmith's puzzle.
But it looks almost like this.
He needed to solve it, but one mistake, and he could cut himself to the bone. From the corner of his eye,
it's the mushrooms on that one that I'm working on. The mushrooms are a little bit different, but it's pretty much that same concept. Hey, Ozart, how you doing, bro?
Small jumps to catch up. Two Rivers men had the second.
Hope you're doing well.
Facing northeast, and Baron considered walking a little north to where Gildan and Lancers were camped, or south to the nearest May intersection. But taking a deep breath, he made himself lead his horse through his friends and neighbors from home.
My wife likes that one.
Huddling in their cloaks and feeding the remnants of their shelters into the cook fires.
I think that's why
the porridge in the kettles.
I'm slacking the way I am on it. It's just because I know that one's next. And
paused in sliding along steep.
that one,
their sibilant whispering. The bow was their preferred weapon.
Is what you call it.
A heavy dagger or a short sword.
The biggest one I've done so far. That would be the biggest one.
They picked up spears.
All the other ones I've done, well, you've seen the ones I've done there. Not that big. That should be the at least the longest one, or tallest, should I say? I think that's why.
Found the pole arms not much different.
I've been slacking on it. It's just because I know that one's coming up.
Hungry, tired, and withdrawn. Someone raised a half-hearted cry of golden eyes, but
and it's a tad, at least in my mind, I know it's not. It's a little intimidating, just because the size of it.
Was leaden. Young Kenley Marin, his cheeks still pale, where he had scraped off his attempt at a beard.
It's where I really don't want to mess it up.
Conger,
it'd probably take me the longest too, just because.
Drunk whenever he could manage it, spat contemptuously.
I'm gonna be going slower. Because for simple fact, like I said, I don't want to mess it up, so I'm going to be making sure that everything's done just right.
Daniel Lewin stood up, tugging nervously at the thick mustache that looked so ridiculous beneath his beak of a nose. Orders, Lord Parent. Actually looked relieved when Parent shook his head.
And I think that's why it takes so much, is because I want to get it done just right. I don't want to have no mess ups.
And Daniel had never had spare flesh on his bones. Behind Perrin.
That, and sometimes I try to make sure they're somewhat straight, but half the time I give up just because unless you have that little piece that you can put on there to do it, then take off and sit back down. Unless you have that piece, it's hard to keep it in a straight line.
Which was not often. And you might just want to keep in a good odor with his employer.
I think that's what should be on my next order list. It's one of those little strips I can sit down to make sure they're all straight.
And Fail's chief, Lenny Eltring,
probably take up more time doing it, but hey, the trade-off is may take more time, but it's gonna look a lot nicer.
And raised a long wooden spoon as if to fend Perrin off. Brianna Taberwin, dark eyes, fierce, face, slapped.
I need to get more of the containers to put them in, because I'm limited on how much I have, and
the second of Fail's three maids.
Most of them are filled up from old ones that's left over. I save them, and I actually keep them separated just in case you might have that unexpected spill to where you can't recover them. So you got some as some in reserve that you can still use to where you're not.
Brady was still wrapped.
It's not ruined.
Snoring away beneath the pine branch lean-to. Perrin walked through his friends and felt alone.
Because I remember, I think I could get like packs of two of them for not that much on eBay or Amazon. And they're both set up for the round beads or the square beads.
Went to the edge of the Gildan
to the way the part shaped.
Left for mounted men to ride out, though Bulwer and Aram had to fall in behind him in the narrow way.
That and
in front of the two rivers men, a man afoot would have.
Then you get a better setup as far as table and a chair.
100 paces distant, easy bow shot.
Because the chair I use is
trees thrusting a canopy high into the sky.
The chair, like in the living room, so it's got very comfortable sitting on the edge.
Elms out there. Some as much as 3 or 4
that
and the base, and oaks that were larger still.
A bigger light table.
Trees
just because of what I have is tad small.
That tried to grow beneath them, leaving wide spaces between. But shadows darker than the night filled those spaces. An old forest, one that could swallow Omri's whole and never give up the bones. Bulwer followed him all the way.
Oh, you're not?
Deciding this
I'm saving them. That's why I have so many of them, of different, like separate. But yeah.
Holding his glove close, he cast a
I just save them out of, I guess, habit. Not like throwing stuff away because how many there is.
He was eager to be moving, and that much farther from his friends.
Hey, Jimmy, how you doing?
On the saddle bow, but refrained from putting a boot in the stirrup. Stepper tossed his head, also impatient.
Jimmy Rizzo, how you doing, bro?
Just as easily.
Welcome.
My lord. A viable possibility, to be sure.
Let me ring your bell.
May I suggest once again, however, that Massima's view of Aes Sedai is very close to that of the White Cloaks. In fact,
hope you're doing well,
he would
Jimmy.
See last sister dead if he could. The Shonchan view is more pragmatic, I may be permitted to call it that. Less in accord with Wasima in any case.
But yeah.
However much you hate white cloaks, Master Bulwer.
But then I've looked up to, there's all kinds of different projects you can do with your extra gems. Like, say you have like a little wooden box, just stencil on an image, and then go through with your extra gems on it till it makes it up there in gems.
He was a man who liked evidence.
Just, I guess, to use your extra ones.
The wise ones, my lord.
I've seen a lot of people post projects of like them doing stuff like that.
Another eye, said I believe the wise ones are much the same. Aaron snorted brief white blooms in the air.
Well, I'll probably be on again tomorrow. Scotch D-Man.
I'll wager stepper against a horseshoe.
Which be pretty early tomorrow when I usually get on it.
Manura was another question.
I gotta well, I'll probably get on, but I gotta still get hold of my mom and make sure she doesn't need any help at her house. If she doesn't need any help, I'll probably get back on again and do some more diamond painting. I need to get on it mainly because
others take actions they believe will help their liege.
I want to see what it's gonna look like when it's done. That's what I always look forward to. I like how it has an image on it. That looks cool and all that, but I'm always excited to see the finished project.
Missouri might actually tell me the truth.
To know that all that time and work you put into it, that it came out good. That hey, if you don't enjoy it, if you don't like it, then I don't know. I like to see what other people's opinion is on it.
And that line of thought might lead to Javier and Nerion. Under the circumstances, who can say who she might tell? Straightforward is not always the best way. Sometimes
no shit, that would be pretty cool.
Behind masks for safety.
Yeah, it's usually around that time that I went on. Yeah, or today, I went on around 11 or noon.
So strong that Karen had to exhale to clear his lungs. Part of him wanted to draw the scent deep and let it consume him. Baron studied Bulwer carefully.
But that would be pretty cool to get a panel.
Could not tell up from down, and they could and did. How far could you trust? Trust was always the question. He had learned that in hard lessons. He took a firm check.
I had to get a headset before I could do that. That way I could actually hear and talk to everyone without trying to do it off my laptop.
They want to be Aiel after all. That ought to give them enough excuse. And maybe one of them can strike up a friendship with Berle, and with her advisor. That should be possible, my lord, Bulwer said after the slightest hesitation. Lady Midori's father is a High Lord of Tyr, giving her sufficient rank.
So I always like having something playing in the background while I do mine.
Possibly one or two of the
mainly books. I throw an audio book on I'm listening to and play it and just start going to town, taking a couple of hits here and there.
Then do it. But Master Bulwer, you've been trying to guide me to this since Solana left us. From now on, if you have a suggestion to make it. Even if I say no to 9 in a row, I'll always listen to a 10th. I'm not a clever man, but I'm willing to listen to people who are, and I think you are. Just don't try poking me in the direction you want me to go. I don't like that, Master Bulwer.
That's something you have to probably work out with everyone, like the right time that works for everyone.
He smelled surprised and gratified.
Because that had to be a lot to do too with all the different time zones people are in too. That would be the hard part.
I won't make the same mistake again, I assure you. My parent, you seem to reach a decision.
Because for me, it's
if I may say so.
12:56.
I have been serving you.
It's almost 1.
In ways I did not expect. You are what you seem, my lord, with no poisoned needles hidden away to catch the unwary. I previous employer was known widely for cleverness, but I believe you are equally clever, in a different way. I believe I would regret leaving your service. Any man might say these things to keep his place.
And me, when I do the dime painting,
Poisoned needles.
the reason I don't do them for so long is
Parent service, Bulwer's last employment had been as secretary.
You're an hour ahead, huh?
Fallen into hard times, so could no longer afford to keep him.
Well, for me, it hurts my back a lot because the chair I have out there, I had to sit at the very edge of it, and then that table I have, it's made to where it could go underneath, to where it's more like up close, but with it being the type of chair it is, it doesn't go that far, so I actually got to sit on the edge of my chair with my light table on top of my other little table.
May I go to find the lady Majority? Aaron nodded. The little man bowed yet again, backing away, then went skittering toward the camp, his cloak fluttering behind him as he dodged through the sharpened stakes, like a sparrow hopping across the snow. He was a strange fellow. I don't trust him.
So I think that light table I have is only like
and I don't trust Solanda in that.
12 inches by 16 inches. So not very big.
You have to trust somebody, Aaron said roughly. The question was who?
But I'll eventually get
He booted the dun in the ribs.
a better chair is pretty much all I would need. Then I'll be able to work that table a little bit better. Something that's not so hard in the back. Because even the chair, the chair I'm in right now is like those thin canvas camping chairs. Let's see if I can show it.
The Shida were welded to the inside of his skull, however, an iron puzzle that would not yield no matter how he twisted. He wrenched it apart. That never worked with a blacksmith's puzzle. After one short burst of speed, he slowed the dun to a walk, feeling a touch of guilt. The darkness beneath the forest canopy was deep, and stone outcrops between the tall trees warned of more hidden beneath the snow.
But
100 places that might break a running horse.
Eventually happened.
Without counting gopher holes and fox dens and badger sets. There was no need to take the risk. A gallop would not free Fail.
Hey, Cassie, how you doing?
Maintain that pace for long in any case.
Oh yeah, let me show you the next one I'm gonna be working on, Cassie.
The road northeast.
It's gonna be the biggest one that I've worked on.
News of the Shido, at least the location. He had hoped for that so often, prayed for it. But today, he knew it would come. Yet knowing only increased his anxiety. Finding them was only the first part of solving this puzzle. Anger made his mind flash from one thing to another, yet no matter what Bulwer said, Aaron knew he was methodical at best. He did not do well trying to think quickly, and lacking cleverness, methodical was going to have to do. Somehow. Aram caught up to him, running his gray hard, and slowed to ride just a little behind him on one side, like a healing hound. Aaron laughed. Aram never smelled comfortable.
Definitely glad you're able to make it, Cassie.
The one time Tinker did not speak.
Yeah, I do these real late night ones that I just listen to a book,
anger and suspicion, and
chill, smoke.
He sat his saddle as tense as an overwhelmed clock spring and watched the forest around them.
The past couple of days I've been doing the diamond painting, diamond art ones, and
in truth, almost
during the day.
Hidden from most men in these woods, where the sky overhead.
How's your evening going, Cassie?
It held a definite tinge of dark grayness, but for the moment, that cast the forest in shadows murkier than night. The trees themselves were massive columns of darkness. Yet even the shift of a black-winged jackdaw on a snow-mounted branch, feathers fluffed against the cold, caught Perrin's eyes, and a hunting pine marten, a deeper black than the darkness, cautiously raising its head on another. He caught the scent of both, too. A faint whiff of man scent came from up in a massive oak with dark.
Oh shit, that sucks, Cassie.
The Gildan
hope you're all right.
Had their mounted patrols circling the camp a few miles out, but he preferred to rely on Two Rivers men.
Hey, Christopher, how you doing?
To rely on Two Rivers men.
Hope you're doing good.
He did not have enough men to ring the camp completely, yet they were used to forests and to hunting animals that might hunt them in turn. Used to noticing movement that would escape a man thinking in terms of soldiers in war. Ridge cats down from the mountains after sheep could hide in plain sight. and bear and wild boar were known to double back on their pursuers and lie in ambush.
There we go.
From branches 30 and 40 feet above the ground, the men could see anything that moved below in time to warn the camp, and with their longbows they could exact a heavy price from anyone who tried to force a way past them. Yet the presence of the guard touched his mind as lightly as the presence of the jackdaw. He was focused ahead through the trees and the shadows, intent on picking out the first sign of the scout's return.
Bravo, Chris. J'espère que tu vas bien.
Turning. Abruptly, Stepper tossed his head and snorted in a spew of mist, eyes rolling in fear as he stopped dead, and Aram's gray squealed and shied. Baron leaned forward to pat the trembling stallion's neck, but his hand froze as he caught a trace of scent. The smell of burned sulfur faint in the air that made the hair on the back of his neck try to stand. Almost burnt sulfur. That was only a pale imitation of this smell. It had a reek of wrongness, of something that did not belong in this world. The scent was not new. You could not ever have called that stink fresh, but not old either. An hour, perhaps less. Maybe about the time he had wakened, about the time he had dreamed of this scent. What is it?
Oh, yeah, Christopher.
Aram was having difficulty controlling his gray, which danced in circles fighting the reins and wanted to run in any direction so long as it was away. But even while sawing at his reins, he had his wolf-head pummeled sword out. He practiced with it daily, for hours on end when he could, and those who knew about such things said he was good.
But I got that one that size, and I got another one that's that size
but it isn't
too.
day yet to me. I can't see anything well enough to matter. Put that
And it
away.
was funny. I started doing these.
Swords wouldn't do any good.
I showed
anyway.
my mom some of them that I
He
did,
had to
or one of
coax
them I
his
did,
trembling
and
to move forward, but he followed the
my
reins,
mom actually gotten
staying
into them.
snow-covered ground
She
ahead.
actually enjoys doing them. She does a lot of them. She gets down on them.
It only took a little while to find what he was looking for, and Stepper gave a grateful
I-
welcome when Perrin reined him in
I
above
thought I
shoulder,
would get him
crest
down,
of
but
stone, 2 paces wide that jutted
she
up
gets
to
him
the ground.
down.
The snow all around
She
was
puts him
smooth
out.
and unmarked, but dog tracks covered the tilted span of stone, as though a pack had scrambled over
I
it
thought
as
I
they
did
ran.
him quick,
Dimness and
but
shadows
no.
or no,
She
they were
puts me
plain
to
to
she puts me to shame on that.
footprints lodging
And
in
she
the
does
palm
them
of his
good.
hand,
She
pressed
doesn't
into
have
stone,
missteps on
as
them.
though it had been mud.
But she'll
He patted Stepper's neck
sit
again.
there and
No wonder
go
the
off
others
on him. Get a
Go
good
back to the
sized
camp
one,
and
like
find Dan
the one
alive.
I'm working on,
Tell him I said to let everyone know there were dark hounds here.
or a little bit bigger
Maybe
than
an
that,
hour
and
ago.
she'll get it done in like
And put
2
your
or
sword
3
away.
days.
You wouldn't want to try killing a dark hound with a sword, believe me.
But she's got
Dark
quite a bit
hounds?
of them done.
Aram exclaimed,
And
peering
she
around
said
at
that
the
she
murky
ordered
shadows between the trees. There was an anxious feeling in
some
sight.
other ones that she said are really
Most
nice
men
that
would have
are
laughed about travelers'
big
tales
ones.
or stories for children. Tinkers roamed the countryside and knew what could be found in the wilds.
my aunt
Aram
ordered
sheathed the sword on his back with
a
obvious
really big
reluctance.
one.
His right hand remained raised.
Cause my aunt does them too. My mom got my
How
aunt
do you
into
kill a
doing them.
dark hound? Can they be killed?
Now they're both sit there at the house
Maybe
and
he did not have
in
much
their
of a sense
chairs
of
at their
that.
table, and
Just
they
be
each got a
glad
little
you don't
light
have to
table.
try, Aram. Now go do like I told you.
Had a light table on
Everyone needs to
on
keep
their
a sharp
table and
lookout
just
in case they come
sit
back.
there and go off all day.
Not much chance of that, I'd say, but better safe. Perrin remembered facing.
But yeah, my aunt got one. It's longer than this
He
one,
thought he had killed one after
but
hitting
it's
it with 3 good broadhead arrows.
it's pretty much one of the Last Supper.
Moraine had to finish that pack with balefire.
It's just like really long and huge.
Make sure the Aes Sedai and Wise Ones learn of this, and the Ashaman. Small chance any of them knew how to make balefire. The women might not admit knowing a forbidden weave if they did, and maybe not the men either. But maybe they knew something else that could work. Aram was reluctant to leave Perrin alone until Perrin snapped at him, and then he turned back toward the camp, trailing smells of umbrage and hurt, as if 2 men would have been a whit safer than one.
What should I be working on
As
next,
the other man was out of
D-Man?
sight, Perrin reined Stepper southward, the direction the dark hounds had been heading. He did not want company for this, even Aram's. Just because people sometimes noted his sharp eyesight was no reason to flaunt it. His sense of smell.
eBay,
There
Amazon.
were already reasons enough to shun him without adding more. It might have been chance that the creatures had passed so near his camp, but the last few years had made him uneasy with coincidences. All too often,
I
they were
definitely
not
appreciate everyone
coincidences at all,
stopping by tonight.
not the way other men counted such
Yeah, that's
things.
why you should get mine from is
This was
eBay
another
and
good
Amazon.
gift to Viren tugging at the pattern. It was a bit he could have done without.
Oh, that's
If they
which
could
one you
take
could be
more
working on
discipline and
next.
advantages, even when it appeared to be working in your favor. The chance that favored you one minute could turn on you in the next.
Yeah, my aunt got her one of those. She got the regular circle one. She didn't get the square one. But yeah, she got the Last Supper.
Or so he had been told. Maybe some shadow spawn could too. The trail he followed was surely near an hour old, but Perrin felt.
But that's usually where I get my dying paintings from, Amazon,
the sky was
eBay.
Still a deep, dark gray where it showed. The sun had not yet crested the horizon.
I'll sit there for
one of the worst times to meet the wild hunt, when darkness was
hours at a time, just looking through until I find one that catches my eye, something that I like, that
and he was not certain
something unique, I guess.
In his
at least
mind,
that I
marked
think
out the
is.
location of a nearby stream, where the camp got its water by chopping through the ice. It was no more than 10 or 12 paces wide.
Which one are you going to be doing after the Aussie?
Putting running water between you and dark hounds would stop them, supposedly. But then, so would facing them, supposedly. And he had seen the results of that. His nose tested the breezes, searching for that old scent, and for any hint of manure. Coming on these things unaware would be worse than unpleasant. Stepper caught scents almost as easily as Perrin, and sometimes noticed what they were sooner. But whenever the dun balked, Perrin forced him forward. There were plenty of tracks scattered in the snow, hoofprints of the mounted patrols going out and coming back, occasional sign of rabbits and foxes. But the only marks left by the dark hounds were where stones.
No shit, hell yes. Scratch your D, man.
Smell was always strong.
That's badass.
Yet enough trace lingered in between to lead him to the next place where their tracks showed. The huge paw prints overlapped one another.
I usually gotta wait in between months when I'm able to afford it when I get my check in. Because after I take everything out to pay the bills, I usually have enough for one or two.
Was that why there were no wolves in the area? He was sure that the certainty.
And then that's why I take my time on them too.
He had been a wolf in the dream. As the trail began to curve to the west, he felt a growing suspicion.
Nice, D-man.
The dark hounds had circled the camp completely.
I think that's why I take my time on it too, because
several huge trees.
I got the one I'm doing.
By their neighbors, each with a
then I got that one I showed you, then another one that size, and then
smooth and flat as
I gotta eventually order some more.
Thin gouge cut through it straight as a plumb line. Nothing resisted the opening of an Ashaman's gateway, and two had opened here. A thick pine that had fallen blocking one had a section 4 paces wide burned out of it, but the charred ends were as neat as if they had come from a sawmill. It seemed that evidence of the one power did not interest darkhounds, however. The pack had not paused there any more than anywhere else, or even slowed that he could tell. Darkhounds could run faster than horses, and for longer, and the stench of them hardly seemed to have faded more in one place than another. At 2 points in that circuit, he had picked up a forking in the trail, but that was only the pack coming from the north and departing south. Once around the camp, and then on their way after whatever or whoever they were hunting. Plainly, that was not him. Perhaps the pack had circled because they sensed him, sensed someone who was Taviran. Yet he doubted that darkhounds would have hesitated one instant coming into the camp had they been after him. The pack he had faced entered the city of Ilion.
Hell yeah, Cassie, that's badass.
But did darkhounds report what they saw the way rats?
That's a good little amount. That'll keep you busy for a minute. I'll be having to go through them and see which one I want to do.
That concerned him more than anything else.
But that's badass. That's a good little amount.
Ways to fight the Forsaken if it came to that.
I'll get there one of these
Whatever
days.
Came between him and Fail, Darkhounds or the Forsaken or anything else,
I have
find a way to go around or through.
Counting the one I'm doing.
A man could only have so much fear in him at one time, and all of his
3,
was centered
4.
on Fail. There just was no room for any more. Before he reached his starting place again, the breezes brought in the smells of people and horses, sharp in the icy cold. He ranged Stepper to a slow walk, and then to a halt. He had spotted some 50 or 60 horses, near 100 paces ahead. The sun had finally peaked above the horizon, and begun to send sharply slanted shafts of light through the forest canopy, reflecting off the snow and lessening the gloom a little, though deep dappled shadows remained between the sun's slender fingers. Some of those shadows enveloped him. The mounted party was not far from where he had first seen the Darkhound's tracks, and he could see arms sickly green.
No shit, and you're getting more? Nice.
Finger garments jarring with the sword on his back.
Hell yeah, Castor.
Most of the riders wore red-rimmed helmets shaped like pots, and dark cloaks over red breastplates, and the long red streamers on their lances stirred in the light airs as the soldiers tried to keep watch in every direction. The first of Mayen often rode out in the mornings with a suitable bodyguard of the winged guards. He started to slip away without having to meet Berlane, but then he saw 3 tall women afoot among the horses, long dark shawls wrapped around their heads and draped over their upper bodies, and he hesitated. Wise ones rode when they had to, if unwillingly, but tramping a mile or 2 in the snow, wearing heavy woolen skirts, was insufficient reason to force them onto horseback. Almost certainly, Sionid or Missouri was in that group as well, though the Aiel women seemed to like Berlane for some reason he could not fathom. He had no thought of joining the riders, no matter who was with them, but hesitation cost him his chance at evasion. One of the wise ones, he thought it was Corell, a fire-haired woman, who always had a challenge in her sharp blue eyes, raised a hand to point in his direction, and the whole party turned, the soldiers whipping their horses around and peering through the trees toward him, lances tipped with a foot of steel half lowered. It was unlikely they could make him out clearly through the deep pools of shadow and bright bars of sunlight. He was surprised the wise one had, but then Aiel generally had sharp eyes. Missouri was there, a slim woman in a
Oh shit, hell yeah.
riding a dapple mare, and Denora as well.
I've seen some of those smaller like ones, and like smaller things you could do, like coasters, and
Berlane herself sat asleep.
my mom and Aunt have these like little stand-up ones that they did. They have like a base on it that light up, but you do the diamond art on it.
She was not.
They got a couple ones like that they did.
A worse flaw ruined it, as far as he was
and
concerned.
Small like little
He
coasters.
had learned of Fail's kidnapping from her.
Ones that you can hang up that are like a string of owls. They're all done with the diamond art.
Slept with Berlane on the very night Fail was taken, and she had done nothing to correct
They've
it.
got a couple cool ones.
It was hardly the kind of story you could ask her to stand up and deny publicly. Yet she could have said something, told her maids to deny it, anything. Instead, Berlane held her silence, and her maids, gossiping like magpies, actually fostered the tale. That sort of reputation stuck to a man in the Two Rivers. He had avoided Berlane since that night, and he would have ridden away now, even after they saw him. But she took a hoop-handled basket from the maid accompanying her, a plump woman wrapped in a blue and gold cloak, then spoke to the others and started her sleek bay gelding toward him. Alone. Anura raised a hand and called something after her, but Berlane never glanced back. Theron did not doubt she would follow wherever he went.
Oh, shit. Hell yeah,
He didn't only make people believe he wanted to be private with her. He dug his heels into Stepper's flanks, meaning to join the others no matter how little he wanted to. Let her follow him back to them if she wanted. But she urged the bay to a canter, despite the rough ground and the snow, even leaping a stone outcrop, her red cloak flowing out behind her, and met him halfway. She was a good rider, he admitted grudgingly. Not as good as Fail, but better than most. Your scowl is quite fierce.
Oh shit, hell
She
yeah.
laughed softly as she halted right
That's
in front of him.
badass.
From the way she held her reins, she was ready to block him if he tried going around. The woman had no shame at all. Smile, so people think we are flirting. She pushed the basket at him with one crimson-gloved hand. This should make you smile, at least. I hear you forget to eat.
That's definitely the thing to do to keep
Her
you
nose
busy.
wrinkled. And to wash, it seems. Your beard needs trimming, too. A careworn, somewhat disheveled husband rescuing his wife is a romantic figure. But she might not think so well of a dirty ragamuffin. No woman will ever forgive you ruining her image of you. Suddenly confused, Perrin took the basket, sitting it in front of him on the tall pommel of his saddle, and unconsciously rubbed at his nose. He was accustomed to certain smells from Berlane, usually those of a hunting she-wolf, and he was the intended prey. But today she gave off no hunting scent, not a whisker of it. She smelled patient as stone, and amused, with undercurrents of fear. The woman certainly had never been afraid of him that he recalled. And what did she have to be patient about? For that matter, what did she have to be amused about? A ridge cat smelling like a lamb would not have confounded him more. Confusion or no, his stomach rumbled at the aromas drifting from the lidded basket. Roasted wood hen, unless he was much mistaken, and bread still warm from the baking. Flour was in short supply, and bread almost as rare as meat. It was true that he missed eating some days. He really did forget sometimes. And when he remembered, eating was a chore, for he had to run the gauntlet of Linny and Brianna,
Snoopy.
or be given the cold shoulder by
Snoopy.
people he had grown up with just to get a meal.
Snoopy.
Right under his nose made
What are
his
you
mouth
doing,
warm.
boy?
Would it be disloyal to eat food brought by Baronet? Thank you for the loaf and the wood hen,
Good
he
boy.
said roughly. But the last thing on earth I want is for anyone to think we're flirting. And I wash when I can, if it's any of your business. It isn't easy in this weather. Besides, nobody else smells any better than I do. She did, he realized suddenly. There was no hint of sweat or dirt under her light, flowery perfume. It irritated him that he had noticed she was wearing perfume, or that she smelled clean. It seemed a betrayal. Berelane's eyes widened momentarily in startlement. Why? But then she sighed through her smile, which was beginning to look fixed, and a thread of irritation entered her scent. Have your tent set up. I know there's a good copper bathtub in one of your carts. You won't have thrown that out. People expect a noble to look like a noble parent, and that includes being presentable, even when it takes extra effort. It's a bargain between you and them. You must give them what they expect, as well as what they need or want, or they lose respect and start resenting you for making them lose it. Frankly, none of us can afford for you to let that happen. We're all far from our homes, surrounded by enemies, and I very much believe that you, Lord Perrin Goldeneyes, may be our only chance of living to reach our homes again. Without you, everything falls apart. Now smile, because if we're flirting, then we aren't talking about something else. Perrin bared his teeth. The Mayenners and the wise ones were watching, but at 50 paces in this gloom, it would be taken for a smile. Luke's respect. Berelane had helped strip him of any respect he once had from the Two Rivers folk, not to mention Fail's servants. Worse, Fail had given him some version of that lecture about a noble's duty to give people what they expected more than once. What he resented was hearing this woman, of all people, echo his wife. What are we talking about, then, that you don't trust your own people to know? Her face remained smooth and smiling, yet the undercurrent of fear in her sense strengthened. It was nowhere near panic, but she believed herself in danger. Her gloved hands were tight on the bay's reins. I've had my thief catchers nosing about in Rosima's camp, making friends. Not as good as having eyes and ears there, but they took wine they supposedly stole from me, and they learned a little by listening. For an instant, she regarded him quizzically, tilting her head. Right. She knew Fail used Solanda and those other idiots as spies. It had been Berelane who told him about them in the first place. Likely Gendar and Santes, her thief catchers, had seen Javiara and Nerion in Rosima's camp. Walwall would have to be warned before he tried to set Midoriya on Berelane and Anura. That would certainly make a fine tangle. When he said nothing, she went on. I put something in that basket besides bread and a wood hen. A document that Santos found early yesterday, locked away in Rosima's camp desk. The fool never saw a lock without wanting to know what it hid. If he had to meddle with what Rosima kept under lock and key, he should have memorized the thing instead of taking it. But what's done is done. Don't let anyone see you reading it after I went to all this trouble to hide it, she added sharply as he lifted the basket's lid, revealing a cloth-wrapped bundle and releasing stronger smells of roasted bird and warm bread. I've seen Rosima's men following you before. They could be watching now. I'm not a fool, he growled. He knew about Rosima's watchers. Most of the man's followers were townsmen, and most of the rest awkward enough in the woods to shame a 10-year-old back home. Which was not to say one or two might not be hiding somewhere among the trees close enough to spy from among the shadows. They always kept their distance, since his eyes made them believe he was some sort of half-tamed shadow spawn, so he seldom detected their scents. And he had had other things on his mind this morning. Fingering the cloth aside to expose the wood hen, almost as large as a fair-sized chicken, with its skin crisply browned, he tore off one of the bird's legs while feeling under the bundle, and sliding out a piece of heavy green-colored paper folded in four. Careless of grease spots, he unfolded the paper atop the bird, a little clumsily in his gauntlets, and read while nibbling on the leg. To everyone watching, he would appear to be studying what part of the wood hen to attack next. A thick green wax seal, cracked on one side, held an impression of what he decided were 3 hands, each with the forefinger and little finger raised, and the others folded. The letters written on the paper in a flowing script were oddly formed, some unrecognizable, but the thing was readable with a little effort. The bearer of this stands under my personal protection. In the name of the Empress, may she live forever, give him whatever aid he requires in service to the Empire, and speak of it to no one but me. By her seal, Surath Sabel Madarth, Abasan Bayring Barsaba, my lady. The Empress, he said softly, soft like iron brushing silk. Confirmation of Massima's dealings with the Shonchan, though for himself he had needed none. It was not the sort of thing Berlane would have lied about. Surath Sabel Meldarth must be someone important to be handing out this kind of document. This will finish him when Sant has testified where he found it. Service to the Empire. Massima knew Rand had fought the Shonchan. That rainbow burst into his head and was swept away. The man was a traitor. Berlane laughed as if he had said something witty, but her smile definitely looked forced now. Santiz told me no one saw him in the bustle of setting up camp, so I allowed him and Genda to go back with my last cask of good Tamagan. They were supposed to return by an hour after dark, but neither has. I suppose they could be sleeping it off, but they've never... She broke off with a startled sound, staring at him. He realized that he had bitten the thigh bone in half, like he had stripped all the flesh from the leg without noticing. I'm hungrier than I thought, he muttered. Spitting the numb bone into the palm of his gauntlet, he dropped the pieces to the ground. It's safe to assume Massima knows you had this. I hope you're keeping a heavy guard around you all the time, not just when you ride out. Galen has 50 men sleeping around my tent as of last night, she said, still staring, and he sighed. He would think she had never seen anybody bite a bone in 2 before. What has Anura told you? She wanted me to give it to her to destroy, so if I was asked, I could say I didn't have it, and didn't know where it was, and she could support my word. I doubt that would satisfy Massima, though. No, I doubt it would. Anura had to know that, too. I said I could be wrong-headed, or even foolish upon occasion, but they were never stupid. Did she say she would destroy it, or that if you gave it to her, she could? Berlane's brow furrowed in thought, and it took her a moment to say that she would. The bay danced a few impatient steps, but she brought him under control easily without attention. I can't think what else she would want, she said after a pause. Massima is hardly likely to be susceptible to pressure. Blackmail, she meant. Baron could not see Massima standing still for that either, especially blackmail by an Aes Sedai. Under cover of tearing the other leg loose from the bird, he managed to refold the piece of paper and tuck it into his sleeve where his gauntlet would keep it from falling out. It was still evidence. But of what? How could the man be both a fanatic for the Dragon Reborn and a traitor? Could he have taken the document from... who? Some collaborator he had captured? But why would Massima keep it locked away, unless it had been meant for him? He had met with Shonchan. And how had he intended to use it? Who could tell what a thing this would allow a man to call on? Baron sighed heavily. He had too many questions and no answers. Answers required a quicker mind than his. Maybe Balwer would have a notion. With a taste of food in it, his stomach wanted him to devour the leg in his hand and the rest of the bird too, but he closed the lid firmly and tried to take measured bites. There was one thing he could find out for himself. What else has Anura said about Massima? Nothing, besides that he's dangerous and I should avoid him, as if I didn't know that already. She dislikes him and talking about him. Another brief hesitation, and Berlain added, why? The first of Mayenne was used to intrigues, and she listened for what was not said. Perrin took another bite to give himself a moment while he chewed and swallowed. He was not used to intrigues, yet he had been exposed to enough of them to know that saying too much could be dangerous. So could saying too little, no matter what Balwer thought. Anura has been meeting with Massima in secret. So has Masuri. Berlain's fixed smile remained in place, but alarm entered her scent. She started to twist in her saddle as if to look back at the 2 Aes Sedai, and stopped herself, licking her lips with the tip of her tongue. Aes Sedai always had their reasons, was all she said.
What is it, buddy?
So was she alarmed over her advisor meeting Musima? Or alarmed that Perrin knew? Or... He hated all these complications. They just got in the way of what was important. Lighty had managed to clean the second leg already. Hoping
Both
Barrelane
my
had not
dogs
noticed,
are
he hastily tossed the bones
laid
aside.
out and passed out
Belly
on the bed.
growled for more. Her people had maintained their distance, but Aram had ridden a short way toward Perrin and Barrelane and was leaning forward to peer at them through the shadowed trees.
Mom's go dirty.
The wise
Need
ones
a
were standing
bath.
to one side talking among themselves, seemingly unaware that they were
The other
over their
one,
ankles in snow,
he
or
probably
that the
due
cold
for a
breezes had
bath,
picked up
but
enough to flap the dangling ends of their
he's on
shoulders.
the bigger
Every so
side.
often, one or another of the three looked Perrin and Barrelane's way too. Notions of privacy never kept a wise one from sticking her nose wherever she wanted. They were like Aes Sedai that way. Masuri and Anura were watching too, though they appeared to be keeping their distance from one another. Perrin would have wagered that without the wise ones there, both sisters would have been using the one power to eavesdrop. Of course, the wise ones probably knew how to do that too, and they'd allowed Masuri's visits to Masima. Would either Aes Sedai crack her teeth if they saw the wise ones listening with the power? Anura seemed almost as careful with the wise ones as Masuri was. He had no time for this briar thicket. He had to live in it, though. We've given tongues enough to wag over, he said. Not that they needed any more than they had. Hooking the basket's hoop handles over his pommel, he heeled Stepper's flanks. It could hardly be disloyal just to eat a bird. Barrelane did not follow immediately, yet before he reached Aram, she caught up and slowed her bay beside him. I'll find out what Anura is up to, she said determinedly, looking straight ahead. Her eyes were hard. Perrin would have pitied Anura if he had not been ready to try shaking answers out of her himself. But then, Aes Sedai seldom needed pity, and they seldom gave answers they did not want to give. The next instant, Barrelane was all smiles and gaiety again, though the scent of determination still hung about her, almost crushing the fear scent. Young Aram has been telling us all about Heartsbane riding these woods with the Wild Hunt, Lord Perrin. Could it really be so, do you think? I remember hearing those tales in the nursery. Her voice was light and amused and carrying. Aram's cheeks turned red, and some of the men beyond him laughed. They stopped laughing when Perrin showed them the tracks in the stone slab. Chapter 7. Blacksmith's Puzzle. When the laughter cut off, Aram put on a smug grin, and with none of the fear scent he had given off earlier. Anyone would have thought he had already seen the tracks himself, and knew everything there was to know. No one paid any mind to his smirk, however, or to much of anything except the huge dog tracks impressed in stone, even Perrin's explanation that the dark hounds were long gone. Of course, he could not tell them how he knew that, yet no one seemed to notice the lack. One of the sharply slanting bars of early morning light was falling directly on the gray slab, illuminating it clearly. Stepper had grown accustomed to the fading burnt sulfur smell. At least he only snorted and laid back his ears, but the other horses shied at the tilted stone. None of the humans except Perrin could detect that smell, and most growled over their mounts' fractious behavior and peered at the oddly marked stone as if it were a curiosity displayed by a traveling show. Barrelane's plump maid screamed when she saw the tracks and swayed on the point of falling off her round-bellied, nervously dancing mare, but Barrelane merely asked Anura in an absent fashion to look after her, and stared at the prince with as little expression as if she herself were Aes Sedai. Her hands tightened on her reins, though, until the thin red leather paled across her knuckles. Bertag Alen, the Lord Captain of the Winged Guards, his red helmet embossed with wings and bearing 3 thin crimson plumes, had personal command of Barrelane's bodyguard this morning, and he forced his tall black gelding close to the stone, swinging down from his saddle in knee-deep snow and removing his helmet, to frown at the stone slab with his one eye. A scarlet leather patch covered the empty socket of the other, the strap cutting through his shoulder-length gray hair. His grimace said he saw trouble, but he always saw the worst possibilities first. Perrin supposed that was better in a soldier than always seeing the best. Masuri dismounted too, but no sooner was she on the ground than she paused with her dapple's reins in one gloved hand, looking uncertainly toward the 3 sun-dark Aiel women. A few of the Mayenner soldiers muttered uneasily at that, yet they should have been used to it by now. Anura hid her face deeper in her gray hood as if she did not want to see the rock, and gave Barrelane's maid a brisk shake. The woman goggled at her in astonishment. Masuri, on the other hand, waited beside her mare with an appearance of patience, spoiled only by smoothing the russet skirts of her silk riding dress, as though unaware of what she was doing. The wise ones exchanged silent glances, expressionless as sisters themselves. Carell stood on one side of Navarra, a skinny green-eyed woman, and on the other, Marlene, with eyes of twilight blue and dark hair, rare among Aiel, not covered completely with her shawl. All three were tall women, as tall as some men, and none looked more than a few years older than Perrin. But no one could have managed that calm self-assurance without more years than their faces claimed. Despite the long necklaces and heavy bracelets of gold and ivory that they wore, their dark heavy skirts and the dark shawls that almost hid their white blouses could have suited farm women. Yet there was no doubt who was in command between them and the Aes Sedai. In truth, sometimes there seemed to be doubt who was in command between them and Perrin. Finally, Navarra nodded and gave a warm and approving smile. Perrin had never before seen a smile out of her. Navarra did not walk around scowling, but she usually seemed to be searching for someone to upbraid. Not until that nod did Masuri hand her reins up to one of the soldiers. Her warder was nowhere to be seen, and that had to be the wise one's doing. Robert usually stuck to her like a burr. Lifting her divided skirts, she waded through the snow, deeper the closer to the stone she came, and began passing her hands above the footprints, obviously channeling, though nothing happened that Perrin could see. The wise ones watched her closely, but then Masuri's weaves were visible to them. Anura displayed no interest. The ends of the Grey Sister's narrow braids twitched as if she were shaking her head inside her hood, and she moved her horse back from the maid, well out of the wise one's line of sight, but that took her farther from Berelain, who anyone could think might want her advice now. Anura really did avoid the wise ones as much as she could. Fireside stories walking, Galen muttered, drawing his gelding away from the stone with a sideways glance at Masuri. Aes Sedai he honored, yet few men wanted to be close to an Aes Sedai who was channeling. Though I don't know why I'm surprised anymore after what I've seen since leaving Marianne. Intent on the tracks, Masuri did not seem to notice him. A stir rippled through the mounted lancers, as though they had not really believed their own eyes until their commander gave confirmation, and some of them began to smell of uneasy fear, as if expecting dark hounds to leap out of the shadows. Perrin could not pick out individuals among so many within ease, but the jittery rankness was strong enough that it had to come from more than a few. Galen seemed to sense what Perrin smelled. He had his faults, but he had commanded soldiers for a long time. Hanging his helmet on his longsword hilt, he grinned. The eye patch gave it a grim quality, a man who could see a joke in the face of death and expected others to see it too. If the black dogs bother us, we'll salt their ears, he announced in a loud and hearty voice. That's what you do in the stories, isn't it? Sprinkle salt in their ears and they vanish. A few of the lancers laughed, though the miasma of fear did not lessen occasionally. Stories told by the fire were one thing, those same stories walking in the flesh quite another.
Hey, Chris, cheers.
Galen led his black to Berelain and rested a gauntleted hand on her bay's neck.
Just
He
cheers.
gave Perrin a considering look.
Try and finish his
Turned
bowl.
levelly, refusing to take the hint. Whatever the man had to say, he could say in front of him and Aram. Galen sighed. They will keep their nerve, milady, he said softly. But the fact is, our position is precarious, with enemies on every side and our supplies running out. Shadow spawn can only make matters worse. My duty is to you and Mayenne, milady. And with all respect to Lord Perrin, you may wish to alter your plans. Anger crackled in Perrin. The man would abandon Fail. But Berelain spoke before he could suggest it. There will be no alteration, Lord Galen. Sometimes
Nice.
forget that she was a ruler, small though Mayenne was, but there was a regal tone in her voice, fit for the Queen of Andor. Back straight, she made her saddle seem a throne, and she spoke loudly enough to make sure everyone heard her decision, firmly enough that everyone knew the decision had been made. If we have enemies all around, then going on is as safe as turning back or turning aside. Yet if turning back or turning aside were 10 times safer, I would still go on. I intend to see the Lady Fael rescued if we must fight our way through 1,000 dark hounds and Trollocs as well. That I have sworn to do. A roar of cheers answered her, winged guards shouting and thrusting their lances into the air, so the red streamers danced. The smell of fear remained, but they sounded ready to cut their way through any number of Trollocs, rather than appear less in Berelain's eyes. Galen commanded them, but they felt more than fondness for their ruler, despite her reputation with men. Maybe because of it, in part. Berlin had kept Tyr from swallowing Mayenne by playing one man who found her beautiful against another. For his part, Baron found it hard not to gape in surprise. She sounded as determined as he was. She smelled as determined. Galen bowed his gray head in unwilling acceptance, and Berlin gave a small, satisfied nod before turning her attention to the Aes Sedai beside the stone slab. Masuri had stopped waving her hands about and was staring at the footprints, tapping a finger against her lips thoughtfully. She was a pretty woman without being beautiful, though some of that might have been Aes Sedai agelessness, with a grace and elegance that might also have come from being Aes Sedai. It was often difficult to tell a sister who had been born on a hardscrabble farm from one born in a grand palace. Baron had seen her red-faced and angry, worn down and on the end of her tether. Yet despite hard travel and life in the Aiel tents, her dark hair and her clothing looked as though she had a maid attending her, too. She might have been standing in a library. "What have you learned, Masuri?" Berlin asked. "Masuri, if you please." "Masuri!" The last came a little more sharply, and Masuri gave a start, as though surprised to realize she was not alone. Possibly she was startled. In many ways, she seemed more of the green Aja than the brown, more intent on action than on contemplation, straight to the point and never vague. Yet she was still capable of losing herself completely in whatever captured her interest. Folding her hands at her waist, she opened her mouth, but rather than speaking, she hesitated and looked a question at the wise ones. "Go on, girl," Navarran said impatiently, planting her fists on her hips in a jangle of bracelets. A frown made her appear more her usual self, but neither of the other wise ones looked any more approving. 3 frowns in a row, like 3 pale-eyed crows on a fence. "We were not simply letting you exercise your curiosity. Get on with it. Tell us what you learned." Masuri's face reddened, but she spoke up immediately, her eyes on Berlin. She could not like being called down in public, no matter what anyone knew of her relationship with the wise ones. "Relatively little is known of dark hounds, but I've made something of a study of them in a small way. Over the years, I've crossed the paths of 7 packs, 5 of them twice, and 2 others 3 times. The color began to fade from her cheeks, and slowly she began to sound as if she were lecturing. Some ancient writers say there are only 7 packs. Others say 9 or 13, or some other number they believed had special significance. But during the Trolloc Wars, Sorolana Alsahan wrote of the 100 packs of the Shadow's hounds that hunt the night. And even earlier, Ivan el Baratia supposedly wrote of hounds born of the Shadow, in numbers like unto the nightmares of mankind. Though in truth, Ivanel herself may be apocryphal. In any case, she gestured as if groping for a word. Smell is not the right word, and neither is flavor. The sense of each pack is unique, and I can say with certainty that I have never encountered this one before, so we know the number 7 is wrong. Whether the correct number is 9 or 13 or something else, tales of dark hounds are much more common than dark hounds themselves, and they are extremely rare this far south of the Blight. A second rarity, there may have been as many as 50 in this pack. 10 or 12 is the usual limit. A useful maxim, 2 rarities combined call for close attention. Pausing, she raised a finger to emphasize the point, then nodded when she thought Berlin had taken it, and folded her hands again. A gusting breeze pushed her yellowish-brown cloak off one shoulder, yet she did not appear to notice the loss of warmth. There is always a feel of urgency about Darkhound's trails, but it varies according to a number of factors, not all of which I can be certain of. This one has an intense admixture of, I suppose you could call it impatience. That isn't really strong enough by far. As well call a stab wound a pinprick, but it will do. I would say their hunt has been going on for some time, and their prey is eluding them somehow. No matter what the stories say...
Give me 1 second and I'll be right back.
Salt doesn't harm darkhounds in the least, so she had not been entirely lost in thought after all. Despite the stories, they never hunt at random, though they will kill if the opportunity presents itself and doesn't interfere with the hunt. With darkhounds, the hunt is paramount. Their quarry is always important to the Shadow, though at times we cannot see why. They have been known to bypass the great and mighty to slay a farm wife or a craftsman, or to enter a town or village and leave without killing, though clearly they came for some reason. My first thought for what brought them here had to be discarded since they moved on. Her gaze flickered toward Perrin, so quickly he was not sure anyone else noticed. Given that, I strongly doubt they will return. Oh yes, and they are an hour or more gone. That, I'm afraid, is really all I can tell you. Navarin and the other wise ones nodded their approval as she finished, and a touch of color returned to her cheeks, though it vanished quickly as she assumed a mask of Aes Sedai serenity. A shift in the breeze brought her scent to Perrin, surprised and pleased, and upset at being pleased. Thank you, Masuri Sedai, Berlain said formally, making a small bow in her saddle that Masuri acknowledged with a slight motion of her head. You have put our minds at rest. Indeed, the fear smell among the soldiers began to fade, though Perrin heard Galen grumble under his breath. She might have told those last bits first. Perrin's ears caught something else, too, through the stamping of horses' hooves and men's quiet, relieved laughter. A blue tit's trill sounded to the south, beyond the hearing of anyone else there, followed closely by the buzzing call of a masked sparrow. Another blue tit sounded, closer, followed again by a masked sparrow. And then the same pair called again, closer still. There might be blue tits and masked sparrows in Otara, but he knew these birds carried 2 rivers longbows. The blue tit meant men were coming, more than a few, and maybe unfriendly. The masked sparrow, that some back home called the thief bird for its habit of stealing bright objects, on the other hand. Perrin ran a thumb along the edge of his axe, but he waited for one more pair of calls, close enough that the others might have noticed. Did you hear that? He said, looking south as if he had just heard. My sentries have spotted Masima. That brought heads up, listening, and several men nodded when the calls were repeated, closer still. He's coming this way. Growling curses, Galen clapped his helmet onto his head and mounted. Anura gathered her reins, and Masuri began floundering back toward her dapple. The lancers shifted in their saddles and began giving off smells of anger, once more touched with fear. The winged guards were owed a blood debt by Masima in their eyes, but none was anxious to try collecting with only 50 men. Not when Masima always rode with 100 at his back. I will not run from him, Berlain announced. She stared south, wearing a cold frown. We will wait for him here. Galen opened his mouth and closed it again without speaking, to her at least. Drawing a deep breath, he began to bellow orders arraying his guardsmen. This was not an easy matter. No matter how far apart the trees stood, forests were poor places for lancers. Any charge would be disjointed at its start, and sticking a man with a lance was difficult when he could dodge behind a tree trunk and come out behind you. Galen tried to form them in front of Berlain, between her and the approaching men, but she gave him a sharp look, and the one-eyed man changed his commands, lining the lancers up in a single crooked rank, bulging around massive trees but centered on her. One soldier Galen sent racing back toward the camp, crouching low in his saddle with his lance low, as if at the charge, riding as fast as he could in spite of the snow and terrain. Berlain raised an eyebrow at that, yet said nothing. Anura began guiding her brown mare toward Berlain, but stopped when Masuri called her name. The brown sister had gathered her dapple, but still stood in the snow with the wise ones around her, who were tall enough in comparison to make her seem less than full-grown. Anura hesitated until Masuri summoned her again, more sharply, and then Perrin thought he heard Anura sigh heavily before she rode to them and dismounted.
All right, everyone, we're going to call into this live. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone keeps stopping by. I definitely appreciate all y'all support.
Je vais y mettre un terme. Je tiens à remercier tout le monde d'être passé. Soyez prudents.